And good Wednesday afternoon. My name is Ryan Belmore. I'm the owner and publisher of WhatsUpNewp. It is just after 3 p.m. here on Wednesday, May 5th, and Frank Krosnich joins me. Hey, Frank.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right, and how are you?
I'm doing okay.
Nice hat. Nice hat. I saw you wearing that on WPLQ today.
It's very popular.
Yes, that's it. And we're going to talk about some important topics today.
Oh, we are. We have John Marion, who's executive director of Common Cause. And as most people know by now, Rhode Island dodged a bullet, and we were able to retain our 2 congressional seats. Much of that is credited to the work of Common Cause and other groups that were incredibly proactive in getting people to participate in the census. And so we squeezed through. We're safe for another 10 years. And who knows? Maybe more people just want to come to Rhode Island. We even grow further. But John, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Frank.
Tell us a little bit about why it's so important to retain the 2 representative seats and how we were able to do it.
Yeah, so a week ago, or I guess now a week and a half ago, we found out that Rhode Island's going to have 2 members of Congress, as you said, for the next 10 years. And we were trending away from that, so it was a bit of a surprise that we retain those, but they're locked in for 10 years until the next census. And it's important because historically, we've never had a single member of the House of Representatives since the original Constitution was written in 1789. Only that 1 year did we have a single member. But practically, it's important because we have more representation, quite frankly. We would have gone from having the 2 smallest congressional districts in the country in terms of population to the largest in terms of population. And it just would have been harder to get a hold of your member of Congress and to get constituent service from their office and things like that. We also retain one of our electoral votes. You know, we're a small state. We don't have a lot of electoral votes and matter that much in presidential elections, but that would have been diminished even more.
It also means a lot of money.
Yeah, so regardless of if we kept the 2nd district, we found 43,000 additional people over the 2010 number. And that is hundreds of millions of dollars. So there are more than 55 federal programs, programs that deliver money to the state for services. And there's roughly, and this is a very rough thing, about $1,800 per person per year that comes back to the state in those federal programs. So if you multiply, 1,800 times 43,000 times 10, you get a really, really big number. And again, it's locked in for 10 years, which is incredibly important because, quite honestly, we pay that money to DC through our taxes, making sure people are counted so that money flows back is incredibly important as well.
We've only seen this is kind of like the tip of the iceberg, if you will, in terms of the census. There's much more to come.
Yeah, so the census is fascinating, right? It's the largest thing the federal government does, except for, a war, right? It's the largest civilian deployment of employees in what the government does. And the first number they give out is what they gave out last week, which is how many people live in each of the 50 states. But over the next 10 years, quite frankly, they're going to be rolling data out. The next big piece of data that's going to come out is in August. And that's going to tell us a little bit about the demographics of the state. How big is Newport? How big is Providence? Where did people move within the state? How many residents of Rhode Island identify with different racial and ethnic categories, and so forth. And so we're going to get a more granular picture of the state. It's worth noting we're also in 2022, we're going to find out a lot more about who we missed. So the Census Bureau actually can statistically identify which populations were most likely not to respond. And so while we're happy to have retained the congressional district, we don't necessarily know that we did a good job at avoiding an undercount of what the Census Bureau calls hard to count populations, which include immigrants, the elderly, and other populations. So over the next 18 months or so, we're going to get a lot more information that will be really valuable to us as a state, to knowing who we are as a state.
So, John, I like to use a calculator, so I took that 43,000, multiplied it by 1,800, and I came up with a figure of $77.4 million a year.
Yeah.
Over the course of 10 years, we're talking about $774 million that counting those people will bring into the state. That was pretty incredible.
Yeah. And so to think of it, that the total effort that was spent by Rhode Island, and it was part public money, it was about $700,000 worth of public money and about $600,000 worth of private money that was raised by the philanthropic community. So we're talking about like $1.5 million was invested, plus a lot of people's time, yielded 700 million. Like, that's a pretty good return on investment. If that were a stock, you'd be Warren Buffett. So it was worth the effort.
Pretty incredible. So we get the numbers that come down in August, I think it is, right? And then they start the redistricting process. I want to go into that a little bit, but my question first is, as they take a look at the numbers and they're going to shift from community to community, would that mean in some communities that there are additional representative or Senate seats or representative seats, or that the communities might lose them, or that they may be shared?
Yeah. So, before we move on to the redistricting, I should really highlight that, I said we spent $1.6 million. That we wasn't Common Cause, right? Common Cause was involved in initiating an effort for the first time to have a community-based outreach effort. So normally the state of Rhode Island relied on the Census Bureau to do all the outreach. And the decision was made in 2018 that the community should do outreach too, because community groups are trusted voices and partners for their members. And so there was a state complete count committee. Money was raised by the United Way and a Rhode Island Foundation and other foundations and donors. And it funded 64 community groups, including about 5 in Newport, who I should know off the top of my head, but I apologize, I don't, who did on the ground outreach in a pandemic, which was even a bigger challenge. So it was really the community groups that did the outreach. Common Cause didn't do much direct outreach. We coordinated some of that outreach, which was our role. So I just want to acknowledge, those foundations, the Complete Count Committee, which was 60 people on that Complete Count Committee from all over the state, and those local partners were the ones who did the actual outreach. But to your question about redistricting,
well, let me say that for a moment to underscore the importance of counting those votes. When we take a look at a state like New York that lost a seat because what was it, 20 some odd thousand people that they lost it by?
No, that it was, I think, 89. So yeah.
Like, look at the size of the state versus Rhode Island.
Yeah, but it's actually funny. So a lot of folks have focused on, that New York lost it by 89, but New York only lost 1 seat, and it was predicted they were going to lose 2 seats. So it was a surprise that they only lost 1, and they barely lost that 1. New York spent over $100 million of private and public money on outreach. Rhode Island, as I said, spent about 1.6 million. The states that were supposed to gain more but didn't, Texas, Florida, Arizona. Florida, for the first time since the invention of air conditioning, did not gain 2 congressional seats. They did $0 worth of outreach. So it appears that the outreach that came from the community, like we did here in Rhode Island, is what made the difference in states. The 3 highest overperforming states in the census against estimates were New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. And those are 3 states that put significant resources into community groups, nonprofits to do outreach. And it clearly, in my opinion, paid off for this one metric. Like I said, we won't find out for quite some time how we did in targeting those hardest to count populations.
So when it comes to redistricting, that I would think is really, rather than looking at the raw numbers, will tell where the balance is. So a lot of pundits are out there saying that red states gained more seats than blue states, but that's not necessarily so when redistricting takes place. That in fact it could be even more power to the red states or less.
Yeah, so the whole point of the census, as I said, this largest civilian undertaking of the government is redistricting, apportionment, and which is dividing the seats among the 50 states and then drawing the boundaries around those districts. And so Rhode Island's about to undertake its process. We didn't think we were going to have to draw 2 congressional districts, but we are, and they're going to have to decide where that line goes in the state. And there was some controversy 10 years ago about, exactly where that line went through the state. They flipped Burrillville from the 1st congressional district to the 2nd congressional district, and there was some controversy around that. Within the state legislature, they're going to have to adjust those boundaries because the Supreme Court, starting in the 1960s, said that the districts have to be of near equal population. And so we're going to have roughly 15,000 people in each House district, roughly 22,000 people in each state Senate district. But depending on where populations moved, we're going to have to move some lines. So for instance, people who are familiar with the with downtown Providence, there are a ton of people living in downtown Providence who weren't there 10 years ago, like a lot of loft conversions and new apartment complexes. Those people, those were empty buildings. There weren't people living in them. And so there are going to be lines that have to move to adjust. And Rhode Island has a unique challenge when it comes to moving lines because we have a lot of islands, right? So you can't represent, South Newport. There is no South Newport. So if you have to move the line in Newport, you're going to move into Middletown by definition, right? Or you're going to move over to Jamestown. And so there's going to be a lot of politics involved in moving those lines to adjust for those populations.
How do we do the redistricting? How is that? Who does that?
Yeah, it's done by historically. The power belongs to the state legislature. That's from the U.S. Constitution, and historically, our legislature delegates drawing the maps to a commission of 18 people, 12 legislators, 6 so-called public members, and they work with a consultant that's hired by the General Assembly, and they've already hired their consultant, and they produce some maps, give them to the legislature, but it's ultimately the legislature's decision whether to accept or amend or reject those maps, because those maps have to be passed basically as a giant bill that divides the state into the many districts. And that commission, which I expect will be constituted very soon, is going to go around the state. I assume they'll be doing these on Zoom this time, but they'll go around the state and take public testimony, and people will get to say, listen, I really think, my district in Newport should be kept whole. You shouldn't divide Newport among 4 state senators, and make comments like that. Or, I think this is my neighborhood in Newport. You shouldn't divide my neighborhood in half and split it among 2 state representative districts. That commission will take that input. That consultant will draw those maps, and then ultimately, sometime probably around the 1st of next year, they'll hand them off to the legislature, and the legislature we'll pass a bill, and then it'll come back to Newport because Newport's going to have to redraw the ward boundaries for the city council. And they have to wait for the state to be done, but they're going to have to draw those.
So who's on this commission?
Yeah, so it's 12 legislators, the bulk of whom come from the majority party and are appointed by the speaker and the Senate president, and then a minority come from the Republicans, in this case, the minority leaders of the House and the Senate. And then there are 6 public members. The public members, however, tend not to be just, a person off the street. Last time they included a lobbyist, the head of the West Warwick Democratic Town Committee, the former head of the College Democrats. They were, for lack of a better term, political insiders. And so it's widely believed the commission, and particularly the consultant, is sort of doing the work of the legislative leadership, right? That they draw the districts for the House, working from the speaker's district out, and they draw the districts in the case of the Senate from the Senate president's district out, right? To give those who kind of behind the scenes control the process, the most control over their own maps, and then it flows from there. Common Cause has over the years been introducing alternatives. Our preferred alternative is take it out of the politician's hands. We think it's a fundamental conflict of interest for politicians to pick their voters in advance of an election. We think independent bodies should do that, like is done in California and Arizona and a number of other states. But that has to be done in our state constitution, and that can't be done in time for the current round. So we actually have a bill in that has its hearing tomorrow in the Rhode Island Senate, S0537. And that bill creates a legislative commission, but it bans lobbyists. It bans party officials. It bans the relatives of public officials. It says, the commission, if they talk to the consultant behind the scenes, they have to say what they said out loud at a meeting. It puts a lot of restrictions on how the commission operates, so that sort of the map drawing comes out of the shadows and into the light.
It would seem that that would be a long shot.
It would be. We're emphasizing to the legislative leadership that, listen, you're probably going to pass your bill, but we have some really good ideas in our bill. So, for instance, we really, really want them to require this commission to accept maps from the public that the public drew on their own. So we're working with partner organizations that can teach people how to draw maps using a website that's free to them, and then submit those maps to this commission. We think the commission should be required to accept those public maps, versus in the past, where the only way you could draw a map was make an appointment with that consultant, sit in the basement of the State House under the watchful eye of the consultant, and draw your map. We think we should sort of set the information free, so to speak. We also want to see when the commission produces its official maps, they should release the underlying data, because the data tells you a lot about what they're trying to do with the map.
John, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit. Something that I learned about today that I think raises some concerns. In Westerly, there's a group that was that apparently was created called Westerly Residents Against Indoctrination. This is a group that is, I don't know how big it is. I don't know. I know of one individual who is spearheading it. They have a private Facebook page. They are putting a great deal of pressure on the schools, calling for people to be fired, calling for a lot of. They don't want any bias training. They don't want. It clearly has some undertones that are concerning relative to racism. They're claiming that there's racial things that are being taught in the schools that that put too much emphasis on blacks and on other other groups and denigrate whites and talking about white privilege and all that. So my question is with that, and I know that's not an area that to get into, but what do we know about the requirements of these groups to be transparent? I have sent an email today to that individual, and I asked them for a list of the names of the people who are members of the group, whether it's formed as a nonprofit, how that individual was elected or had became the head of this group. And I'm not anticipating a great response to that, but it seems to me frightening that special interest groups like this can just form without any sense of transparency.
Yeah, so there's it's interesting you raise that, because there was a case before the U.S. Supreme Court last week about the transparency of nonprofits, because California has a very stringent law about transparency, and it's been challenged. And there were arguments last week in it, and the decision will come out by June. That you have to distinguish between a couple of things. The big distinction is, are they involved in elections, right? So if you're involved in elections, the Supreme Court has said you can require enhanced transparency around the money they spend, right? So if they don't spend any money, there's no transparency. But as soon as they start spending money, there are a variety of laws that apply around transparency with elections. But if all they're doing is talking about issues, not in the context of support this candidate or defeat this candidate, or support this ballot initiative or defeat this ballot initiative, that's called issue advocacy. And there really aren't a lot of rules around, and the Supreme Court has frowned on rules around transparency around issue advocacy. That said, if they lobby at the state level or in certain cities in Rhode Island, Westerly not being one of them, but for instance, Providence, if you lobby, if you spend money on lobbying, then that triggers rules. So I have to register as a lobbyist, both in the state level in the city of Providence, and report money I spent on that activity. So it's pretty complex. If it's just a community group not spending money, they don't have to tell you who they are. If they have 501c3 tax status with the IRS, they have to tell the IRS some limited information, but not all of that becomes public, and it doesn't become public in a timely fashion. It really, what triggers it is electoral activity, what they call electioneering.
It'll be interesting to watch what happens. I'll let you know whether or not I get an answer to my questions. Yeah. I suspect not. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these election laws that are being passed nationally that seem to suppress voting, and what we're doing, because I know there are some legislative initiatives now that actually will make it easier to vote in Rhode Island.
Yeah, so there is this reaction to the 2020 election, where we're seeing, particularly in a lot of state legislatures that are controlled by Republicans, like in Florida and Georgia, a decision to clamp down, particularly on the use of mail ballots. Sorry about that.
Bless you.
Thank you. And we're a nonpartisan organization. We support voting rights, regardless of it's Republicans or Democrats supporting voting rights. Historically, voting rights were a bipartisan issue. The Voting Rights Act, which is the single most important federal law to protect voting rights, it has to be reauthorized every 10 years, and it was reauthorized back in the early 2000s. It was a 98-0 vote in the U.S. Senate. hard to imagine that happening now, right? Voting rights have become polarized. So in the Georgias, Texases, Floridas, what we're seeing in particular is that they're polarizing around mail ballots in many respects, because prior to the pandemic, mail ballots weren't that controversial. They were actually used by older voters primarily, who oftentimes trended Republican. And but the election administrators had to liberalize the option of voting by mail during the pandemic, just to keep people safe, right? To keep people away from crowded polling places where they might catch COVID. And the former president demonized those mail ballots and said they were, as a category, fraudulent, which is a lie, which is an absolute lie. And so state legislatures, sort of following that lie, are clamping down on the use of mail ballots. There are some folks in Florida in the Republican Party saying we got to slow down because there actually are voters who use these mail ballots. So it'll be interesting to see the reaction. But there are also clearly other targeted efforts, not just around mail ballots, like in Georgia. There are efforts targeted particularly at Black voters, getting rid of Sunday voting in Georgia, which is a big day for what they call Souls at the Polls, where historically Black churches would do voter get out the vote drives and have voters go vote early on Sundays. Georgia ended early voting on Sundays, but not on Saturdays, right? Like, I think they couldn't be more transparent about what they were trying to do there. Rhode Island, ironically, is not very progressive on voting rights. And we're very old-fashioned. In 2016, 93% of Rhode Islanders voted at their polling place on Election Day, which was one of the highest percentages in the country. We made mail ballots and early voting far more accessible because of the pandemic in 2020. And we want to continue pushing in that direction. So Common Cause is leading a coalition called the Voting Access Coalition. We have a campaign called Let RI Vote. And Senator John Oyer of Newport is the sponsor of our signature piece of legislation for that campaign, which is S516. And the House bill is H6003. And people can go to letrivote.org and find out a lot of information about it. But essentially, we want to take some of the changes that were made because of the pandemic, which were very popular, like mail ballot drop boxes, right? There's a big one in front of Newport City Hall, right at the bottom of the steps. They worked marvelously. Let's put those in the law and keep them there because those don't exist in the law. Those were done on an emergency basis. They passed a law to allow some early voting. Let's expand it to a weekend. Georgia has 3 weekends. We have 0. So let's have some weekend voting for voters who want to vote in person, but find they can't get there on a Tuesday in November. Let's make mail ballots more accessible. Rhode Island is one of 3 states in the nation that require either a notary public signature or 2 witnesses on a mail ballot. That was suspended for the pandemic elections. There were no problems, but it goes back into effect with our next elections. The only other 2 states that require that are Alabama and North Carolina. And if you're in a sentence that has the word Alabama and the phrase voting rights in it, you're not in good company, right? Alabama is where Bloody Sunday occurred. That's where John Lewis was attacked by dogs and water cannons. That is not a pro-voter state. And so, we really, really need to make some of these changes in order to catch up with modern times. Quite frankly, we're just, way behind the times, as is true of New England generally. We've been very traditional and haven't been more advanced the way particularly Western states have in allowing people to choose their method of voting.
John, just a couple of more things, and I wanted to turn to campaign finance a little bit. And I look at quite often the fines that are levied by the Board of Elections for individuals who file late or don't file at all. Governor Raimondo, it was a few years ago, put in legislation that would have prohibited individuals who owed at a certain level that they could not run for office. And I presume, looking at those that maybe are late in a filing and maybe get a $25 fine, that you can not so much let it pass, but you realize that that's just an innocent mistake. But there are some with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of fines that are sitting out there based upon the fine plus the penalties, and it's closing in on $5 million, I think, in total. How do we deal with that? It looks like the Board of Elections doesn't have a magic wand to be able to take care of it. And it doesn't look like, I'm going to be honest, I asked this question of the governor, Governor McKee, in an interview we had a week or so ago, and he didn't seem to know what it was about at all. So where do we go with it?
Yeah, Rhode Island on paper has some of the better campaign finance laws in the country. So you can only give $1,000 per year to a politician, which is one of the lower caps in the country. And there is a regular disclosure of the source of the donation. And, we actually have a very good database where you can search donations in great detail. But there's this loophole, which is if a politician decides to thumb their nose at that and say, I'm not going to report, the tools available to the State Board of Elections, which is in charge of enforcing them, are somewhat limited, right? They have significant power, but they don't have what I think many would consider sort of the death penalty of campaign finance, which is they don't have the power to say you can't run for re-election. And we've had some politicians in the state who decided that they'll take the political hit for not reporting who their donors are and run for re-election, and the board hasn't pursued them, in my opinion, historically, aggressively enough. The board has gotten more aggressive in recent years, to their credit, to their great credit. But there was a period of over a decade where the board really didn't aggressively use all the tools at their disposal, because the board can go to court and try to, attach a lien or garnish wages and things like that. But they haven't historically used those tools as regularly as they should. So this big pile of outstanding fines has accrued, and it's almost too big a pile to kind of dig themselves out of. So as you said, Governor Raimondo did put in some legislation we supported that was very good, that contained that death penalty, so to speak, that would have used the board's ability to deny somebody a line on the ballot, which is, the most important thing a politician needs to get elected, is to be on the ballot. But the General Assembly just hasn't passed it. And now Governor McKee didn't put it in. So Common Cause is going to have to look into whether next year we try to put that legislation in ourselves. We certainly supported it when Governor Raimondo put it in.
Governor McKee, before actually he was appointed to that position, advocated or said he would advocate for linking the governor and lieutenant governor's position to run as a team, as opposed to now when they run separately. And we do know that the communication between the lieutenant governor and the governor, between Dan McKee when he was lieutenant governor and Governor Raimondo, could have been a lot better. What's Common Cause's position?
Yeah, we support the idea that they have to run as a ticket. I think everybody recognizes that the transition from Governor Raimondo to Governor McKee was not ideal. They hadn't met in person in over a year during this pandemic. And then he was thrust into the role of managing the state when he wasn't really, it's not that he wasn't part of her team. He wasn't even, read into sort of what her team was doing. And the only, short of a governor reaching out to a lieutenant governor and bringing them in, which we saw, for instance, Lincoln Chafee do with Elizabeth Roberts during her second year. He brought her onto the team, even though he didn't have to. But we've seen plenty of examples where Carcieri didn't bring Governor Fogarty, or then Lieutenant Governor Fogarty or Lieutenant Governor Roberts in on anything. They were from the opposite political parties. We we think that forcing them on a ticket together, or not forcing, allowing them to form a ticket is a better alternative. And there are different ways to do a ticket. We think there are wrong ways and right ways. New York says whoever wins the primary for lieutenant governor, whoever wins the primary for governor, they're the ticket. Well, you can have, that's an arranged marriage. I don't think that's going to work. So we support, whoever the nominee is, they get to pick their running mate for the general election.
Now, that the only way we can change that is through a constitutional amendment, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, yep. And there are some in the legislature that we support, but that would be the only way. And the constitutional amendments can only be on the ballot in general elections. So even if it's put on the ballot, it wouldn't take effect until after the 2022 governor's race.
So that will be interesting. One last question, and then I want an overall question. If I'm correct with Governor McKee, we have term limits, but he actually has the if he wins, quote, re-election, and then wins the next time around, or actually he could run it next time around, but he could potentially serve for 10 years.
Yeah, so there's a quirk in our state constitution that says if the lieutenant governor in this case is serving less than 2 years of the term that they were succeeded to, then they can run for 2 more full terms. So had Governor McKee taken over in December, he could only run for re-election once, but he'll be able to run for re-election 2 more times. So he could potentially serve for just a little under 10 years if he's successful.
So my last question to you, and I certainly want to leave open if there are things that you think important that we should be aware of, or things coming up in the legislature, but I wanted to get your take, kind of visionary, if you will, with all that's going on in terms of the turmoil in various states seeking to suppress voting through the legislatures, or through certain actions. And a lot of this, the turmoil that we've had in terms of the democracy and denying the results of the last election. Are you hopeful?
I think last November's election was a perilous moment for our democracy, and the January 6th insurrection continued to show how perilous it is. I think the United States has always held itself up as sort of the exemplar of democracy, and looked down our noses at other more fragile democracies, not acknowledging that our democracy is fragile too. I think that it's still fragile. I don't think the fact that on January 20th, there was a peaceful transition of power means that, everything is back to a state where our democracy is not fragile. And so I think, those of us who believe in democracy with a small d have to double our efforts in order to strengthen our democratic institutions. And that's why I love what I do for a living, and getting up and going to work in the morning, or now it's getting up and staying home and going to work in the morning. But it, you know, the work doesn't stop. It becomes more important. What remains to be seen is whether or not, you know, the almost half the electorate that believes that it was a fraudulent election, which is a lie, you know, will, you know, accept future election results. You know, one of the things that I work on is I work on audits of elections. I have a little bit of expertise in how we audit elections to make sure that the machines worked correctly and we had the correct outcome. And it's fascinating because like after 2016, I was working with Democrats on that issue, and now I'm working with Republicans. And you know, I think we have to find issues like good election audits that both sides see as validating, and dig in on those sorts of issues. You know, I think there is still some common ground in between the two parties on making our elections better, and we have to double down on that common ground.
Anything you think is important to add, John?
You know, I think it's important for people in Rhode Island to realize, you know, our state is small enough that they can get involved in their democracy, right? And we all pay attention to cable news and what's happening in DC, but what's happening in Providence, or what's happening at the Newport City Council or the Middletown Town Council, or so forth, is equally important to their daily lives, maybe more important to their daily lives. And in some ways, government has become more accessible because of the pandemic, because you can attend your school committee meeting on Zoom, right? And people should maybe spend a little, you know, less time worrying about the latest with the filibuster in Washington, and a little more about what's happening at their school committee. And they will find it rewarding because they can have a big impact in their local community that'll affect their life and their family's life and their communities. And you know, I'm trying to find sort of like, what is the silver lining of the pandemic, right? The silver lining will be if we come out of this with, you know, voting is more accessible for all voters, right? Because we learned we don't have to vote the way we have for 100 years in Rhode Island. That was just a tradition that we, you know, kept doing because it was a tradition, but it wasn't a good practice. Or, you know, maybe we keep some school committee meetings online because it allows people to participate while they're getting dinner on the table for their kids. You know, so let's try to take the better things that came out of the pandemic in terms of democracy and move forward.
John, I want to thank you. I just want to note that we rely more and more on groups like Common Cause and Common Cause in particular, because you're out there doing the work that's necessary to try and maintain our democracy. I was shocked the other day when I mentioned Common Cause to a town council person from a community across the bay from Newport. So I'm not going to mention which it is. And they didn't know what Common Cause was. I am absolutely baffled and chagrined that any elected official would not know Common Cause and the work that you have done and how essential you are to our community. But you know, we're gonna do as best we can to continue to promote Common Cause. You can visit the website. I know that we've been scrolling the website. On the bottom, it's commoncause.org/Rhode Island, Rhode-Island. And you could probably use financial support if people want to do that as well. But there are ways to get involved.
Yeah, and there are ways, you know, and of course we can always use financial support. I didn't mention, you know, we're a member organization, right? So, and there are ways though to be involved, and you go to our website, that don't involve money, right? So you can get active with us as an organization. in many ways, and we try to be as open to as many people as we can to getting involved if you care about these issues.
You've provided extremely strong leadership for Common Cause, as did Phil West before you. This is an organization that has not had a lot of executive directors, but the ones that have been there have been quality individuals.
Thanks. That means a lot. There was a woman, I want to acknowledge her, between Phil and I for less than 2 years. Christine Lopes headed the organization. So Phil started all the way in 1988. And
I thought Phil started in 1888.
No. So he wouldn't appreciate that.
Okay. But again, John, thank you so much for being with us, and we'll talk with you as we go through. Really interested to see as we conclude this legislative session how you feel with the new leadership that compares to the old leadership. But it's been crazy with this pandemic, and maybe we're a little premature with that question.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us.